This is Land of Havilah, Leviticus 11. From start to finish in this chapter, Yahweh will categorize all living creatures into one of two categories, clean or unclean, and some as abominable. In the New Covenant, there is no animal or object that's religiously clean, unclean, or abominable. Christians may handle, touch, and eat without restriction, Colossians 2:21. But for an Israelite under the now defunct law of Moses, he became personally unclean or defiled if he came in contact with the dead body of any creature in the unclean category, but his uncleanness or defilement only lasted until evening if he took proper steps. And he shouldn't ever knowingly eat any creature in the unclean category. When an Israelite participated in any holy activity, such as when he approached the tabernacle or temple or partook of any sacrifice, he had to be ceremonially clean. Avoidance of the unclean was a worthy goal any time, but staying clean on a perpetual basis wasn't attainable, as we can deduce from the ordinances coming up. But at all times he was to maintain a mental aversion to some living creatures, especially if that creature was dead, or even if the creature was alive if it was in the abominable category. And there were some rules about the clean and unclean which would cause an Israelite to take corrective action right away, even if he didn't plan on visiting the tabernacle. For example, if a mouse or other creeping thing fell into a vessel containing food, or onto a range or into an oven, he had to break those items. The rules coming up seem complicated to us, but we might assume if a child grew up in an observant family, he'd learn the rules very easily. Verse 1. Yahweh spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying to them, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, These are the living things which you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth. Whatever parts the hoof and is cloven-footed, and chews the cud among the animals, that you may eat. Nevertheless, these you shall not eat of these that chew the cud, or of those who part the hoof. The camel, because he chews the cud but doesn't have a parted hoof, he's unclean to you. The coney, because he chews the cud but doesn't have a parted hoof, he's unclean to you. The hare, because she chews the cud but doesn't part the hoof, she's unclean to you. The pig, because he has a split hoof and is cloven-footed but doesn't chew the cud, he's unclean to you. Of their meat you shall not eat, and their carcasses you shall not touch, they're unclean to you." Comment verses 1 and 2, Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, "I'm about to classify all living creatures so that you know which ones you can eat." In verses 3 to 8, he gave the ordinance for hoofed animals. Israelites could eat hoofed animals when they both chewed the cud and had a split hoof. For some examples, cattle, sheep, and goats met both requirements, therefore they were clean, but camels, hares, and pigs didn't meet both requirements and were therefore unclean. Clean creatures were edible and unclean creatures not edible. It was no problem to touch a living hoofed animal that was unclean, such as a donkey. Donkeys were even status symbols, Judges 5:10, but an Israelite shouldn't eat one or touch a dead one in ancient Israel. As we go forward, your narrator might speak in the present tense to keep the language simple, but the listener will understand that these rules only applied to Israelites under the Old Covenant. Coming up, the law for aquatic animals was very simple. Verse 9. "These you may eat out of all that are in the waters. Whatever has fins and scales in the waters, in the seas and in the rivers, that you may eat. All that don't have fins and scales in the seas and in the rivers, of all that move in the waters, and of all the living creatures that are in the waters, they are abominable to you, and you shall detest them. You shall not eat of their meat, and you shall detest their carcasses. Whatever has no fins nor scales in the waters, that is an abomination to you." Comment, an aquatic creature must have both fins and scales. Coming up, birds. This is an interesting category because Yahweh sometimes used birds as symbols of the kingdom of darkness. This includes Genesis 15, when birds tried to pick at Abraham's sacrifices, Genesis 40, when birds ate the bread out of the baker's basket, Matthew 15, when birds ate the seed of the Word of God, Revelation 19:17, when an angel will command birds to come and eat the flesh of Christ's enemies, and Revelation 18:2, when Babylon will become a prison of every unclean and hateful bird. As we'll see coming up, some birds were okay, but not birds of prey or scavenging birds. Verse 13. These you shall detest among the birds, they shall not be eaten, they're an abomination. The eagle and the vulture, and the black vulture, and the red kite, any kind of black kite, any kind of raven, the horned owl, the screech owl, and the gull, any kind of hawk, the little owl, the cormorant, the great owl, the white owl, the desert owl, the osprey, the stork, any kind of heron, the hoopoe, and the bat. Comment in verse 13, the birds Yahweh just named are detestable and not to be eaten. The common feature of them was that they picked at flesh, either as birds of prey or scavengers. Now insects coming up, the ones with two long folded legs in the back for hopping, such as grasshoppers, were clean and edible, but otherwise insects were unclean, therefore not edible. Verse 20, all flying insects that walk on all fours are an abomination to you. Comment, of course insects generally have 6 legs, but some, like the praying mantis, only use 4 of them for walking and the other 2 like arms. Insects were generally off limits, but the following ones that hop were okay. Verse 21. Yet you may eat these, of all winged creeping things that go on all fours, which have legs above their feet with which to hop on the earth. Even of these you may eat, any kind of locust, any kind of katydid, any kind of cricket, and any kind of grasshopper. Comment, personal story here. Your narrator's grandfather fished with crickets. He said roaches worked better, but he wasn't going to handle a roach. Many of us agree that we'd rather touch a cricket than a roach. So it's interesting that Yahweh made the same distinction here, that hopping insects were okay and the rest of the insects not. And the same seems to hold true in other categories as well. For example, that we'd rather eat a cow, which was clean under the law of Moses, than a donkey, which was unclean, even though we don't generally know the old law. So it's just interesting that many of Yahweh's ordinances seem to coincide with our natural inclinations. Verse 23, but all winged creeping things which have 4 feet are an abomination to you. By these you'll become unclean. Whoever touches their carcass shall be unclean until the evening. Whoever carries any part of their carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. Comment is starting to get a little complicated in verse 23 because unclean insects were abominable dead or alive. If you touch a dead one, you're unclean until evening. If you accidentally touch a live one, you're not unclean, but you should have a mental aversion to it. Back to hoofed animals now, verse 26. Every animal which parts the hoof and is not cloven-footed, nor chews the cud, is unclean to you. Everyone who touches them shall be unclean. Comment, this is also translated animals, quote, with a split hoof that isn't completely divided, end quote. It's a subcategory of hoofed animals. Yahweh didn't give any examples of this, but to touch even a living one rendered an Israelite unclean. Coming up, pawed animals. Think dogs, wolves, jackals, lions, bears. Verse 27. Whatever goes on its paws among all animals that go on all fours, they're unclean to you. Whoever touches their carcass shall be unclean until the evening. He who carries their carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. They are unclean to you. Comment, they're unclean, but no mention of being abominable. It's no problem to touch a live pawed animal, but to touch a dead one, you'll be unclean until evening, and if you carry a dead one, you'll have to wash your clothes and be unclean until evening. This might sound more constricting than it was in practice. For example, Samson found a beehive in a lion's carcass and ate the honey from it. He was unclean until evening, assuming he touched the carcass. Therefore, he couldn't go to the tabernacle that day, but he didn't plan on going to the tabernacle anyway. Coming up, the category called creeping things, which is based on the way the animal walks. These animals creep or scoot and were unclean. Verse 29. These are they which are unclean to you among the creeping things that creep on the earth, the weasel, the rat, any kind of great lizard, the gecko and the monitor lizard, the wall lizard, the skink, and the chameleon. These are they which are unclean to you among all that creep. Whoever touches them when they are dead shall be unclean until the evening. Comment, the creeping category included small reptiles and lizards, small mammals. Creeping is also translated to teem or swarm. They were unclean and therefore inedible. They were touchable when alive, but a dead one rendered an Israelite unclean. Coming up, a dead creeping thing, such as a dead mouse. is slightly problematic or even ruinous to the thing it contacts, whether it be a vessel, clothing, skin, food, drink, oven, or range. If it came in contact with one's water source or dry seed, it was okay. Speaking again of dead, creeping animals like a mouse, verse 32. On whatever any of them falls when they're dead, it shall be unclean, whether it's any vessel of wood or clothing or skin or sack, whatever vessel it is, with which any work is done, it must be put into water, and it shall be unclean until the evening, then it will be clean. Every earthen vessel into which any of them falls, all that is in it shall be unclean, and you shall break it. All food which may be eaten, that on which water comes, shall be unclean, and all drink that may be drunk in every such vessel shall be unclean. Everything whereupon part of their carcass falls shall be unclean, whether oven or range for pots. It shall be broken in pieces. They're unclean and shall be unclean to you. Nevertheless, a spring or a cistern in which water is gathered shall be clean, but that which touches their carcass shall be unclean. If part of their carcass falls on any sowing seed which is to be sown, it is clean. But if water is put on the seed and part of their carcass falls on it, it's unclean to you. Comment: if we were inclined, we could explain these ordinances having to do with creeping things based on the need to prevent infectious disease, but for most of the other ordinances in this chapter, there's no explaining them on that basis. Overall, the idea behind clean and unclean seemed to be more a matter of maintaining dignity because, as Yahweh is about to say, you shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. Coming up, even a clean animal like a sheep was a little problematic if found dead. An Israelite could still carry it and eat it, but he had to wash his clothes and be unclean till evening. Verse 39. If any animal of which you may eat dies, he who touches its carcass shall be unclean until the evening. He who eats of its carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. He also who carries its carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. Comment: later on in Leviticus 22:8, a priest was a distinct case. He shouldn't eat any animal found dead. 40 years from now, when Israel is about to enter the Promised Land, Yahweh will tighten up this law. From that point on, no one should eat anything that dies of itself. Deuteronomy 14:1. Why did Yahweh tighten it? We don't know, but we trust he knew what he was talking about both times. He'll also say 40 years on that an Israelite may give or sell a dead animal to a foreigner for him to eat, but he shouldn't eat it himself. Quote, for you're a holy people to Yahweh your God, Deuteronomy 14:21. This is another confirmation that Yahweh didn't intend these laws for anyone but Israel. Back to the subject of animals that creep or scoot, such as mammals and reptiles, verse 41. Every creeping thing that creeps on the earth is an abomination. It shall not be eaten. Whatever goes on its belly and whatever goes on all fours, or whatever has many feet, even all creeping things that creep on the earth, them you shall not eat, for they are an abomination. You shall not make yourselves abominable with any creeping thing that creeps. You shall not make yourselves unclean with them, that you should be defiled thereby. Comment: creeping animals such as mice were in the abominable category, same as aquatic animals lacking fins and scales, birds that picked at flesh, bats, and most insects. Most of us would naturally agree that they're abominable. Verse 44. For I am Yahweh your God. Sanctify yourselves therefore and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not defile yourselves with any kind of creeping thing that moves on the earth. For I am Yahweh who brought you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. Comment: God calls Christians to holiness as well, quoting this same verse. Quote, you shall be holy, for I am holy, as requoted in 1 Peter 1:16. But our holiness doesn't derive from what we eat or drink. In summary, verse 46, this is the law of the animal and of the bird and of every living creature that moves in the waters and of every creature that creeps on the earth, to make a distinction between the unclean and the clean, and between the living thing that may be eaten and the living thing that may not be eaten. Comment: in summary, Israel's diet from the animal kingdom included cloven-hoofed creatures that chewed the cud, aquatic creatures with fins and scales, birds except the flesh eaters, hopping insects, and that was it. Most creatures were unclean. It's the same with us today in the West, that of all that's out there, we eat very little of it by choice, and our choices are similar to what Yahweh prescribed in Leviticus 11, but notably we eat pork, aquatic animals without fins and scales such as shrimp, and a few other things the Israelites didn't. In the New Covenant, God's declared all living creatures to be clean, Romans 14:20, quote, all things are indeed clean, end quote. So it's lawful to eat anything we want, but still it seems we were born with some of the same distinctions that Yahweh made in this chapter. And out of consideration, we shouldn't eat anything in the presence of others if our eating of it offends them, Romans 14:20. Leviticus 12's next at landofhavilah.net.